So priority number one, right at the top of the list, is looking at your spine. When we're looking at the spine, the biggest thing there is, are we in control of what our spine is doing? Are we in control of the position that our back is in when we're doing an exercise? Most of the time, that means, or we're thinking, is the spine neutral? In the majority of exercises that we're going to do, it's going to be beneficial to maintain a neutral spine position. And when we look at the majority of exercises, this would be your classic gym exercises, things like squats, lunges, deadlifts, presses, pull downs, pull ups, rows, hamstring curls, jumping jacks, burpees, leg extensions. The list keeps going. But all those sort of classic gym exercises or resistance training exercises are things that arguably should be done with a neutral spine. And there are multiple benefits to maintaining this neutral spine position in your exercise. One of them is just force transfer. If you pick an exercise, let's say you pick in a back squat. So you got a barbell on your back, you're doing a squat. The force that you're producing in your legs has to move through your body in order for you to move that weight up and down. If you're maintaining a neutral spine, a nice rigid torso position, then the force is going to transfer really well through your body. If you're getting loose, if things are moving around in your back when you're squatting, some of that force that you could be producing through your legs, move yourself up and down, is going to get lost. So there's a benefit just in pure force execution of your exercise of keeping your spine neutral. Then we have a couple benefits that are related to back pain. And there are two main mechanisms that we'll look at with this neutral spine concept for how we can prevent or reduce back pain in exercise. The first one has to do with your discs in your spine. So if in your spine you've got a vertebrae, and in between that you have a disc. When we're in a neutral spine position, the pressure on that disc from front to back and side to side is even. If we get into a flexed position, then the pressure, so here's a vertebrae and here's a vertebrae, disc in between. If we're flexed forward, then we're putting more pressure on the front of that disc. Your disc is made up of two parts. If we look at the big picture of a disc, it's got a hard or firm, tough, robust, cartilaginous outside, and then it's got like a soft, jelly-like inside. Kind of like a Boston cream or a jelly donut. If we're in this position of flexion, where we're pressing more on the front of the disc than the back, then the soft jelly-like interior contents start to move their way towards the back. Just because we're pressing down on the front, we're essentially squeezing that stuff out towards the back. It can start to bulge out the back without actually leaving the disc itself, but it'll force the outside of that disc out, and that's what we call a bulging disc. If you're unlucky and you have a bulging disc, then that bulge is going to press on a nerve, and that will cause you some pain. So we want to avoid that if we can. If it keeps going past the bulge, it can actually rupture. And this is where if you have a jelly donut and you squeeze it and some of the jelly comes out the outside, it's kind of what happens in your disc as well. And we call that a herniated disc. So when the inside soft jelly-like contents actually make their way outside of the disc. And again, if you're unlucky and you get a herniated disc, that can press on a nerve, and then that nerve can cause you pain. So when we're looking at neutral spine and exercise, one of the things we're looking at is, can we keep an even pressure distribution on the intervertebral discs of our spine so that we don't get this bulging or herniation happening, which creates potential for pressing on nerves and therefore potential for pain. So that's one way that we can look at maintaining a neutral spine in exercise in order to prevent or reduce back pain. The other reason that pertains to back pain, why we want to maintain a neutral spine when we do exercise, is because the vertebrae that are above and below each other can actually come into contact at something called a facet joint. It's a very small piece of bone in the vertebrae above and the vertebrae below where they can touch each other. When we're in a neutral spine position, there is space between these facet joints. They're not making contact. When we look at exercise and how this can be aggravating or a source of back pain, that's when we get into a position of extension. So when we get spinal extension, all these vertebrae get closer together, and then the facet joints come together and make contact. The more extension we have, the more pressure there's going to be between those little, small, bony contact surfaces between the vertebrae and the facet joints. So maybe you can imagine if you're doing your back squat or deadlift or insert X exercise here, and you're doing it in extension, these vertebrae at the facet joints are making contact. If you're just standing here, not so bad. Maybe for some people you feel aggravation here. But imagine adding a couple 100 pounds or even 100 pounds to that system. So now those facet joints are being really rammed together with extra force. And if there's any movement at all, that could start causing some discomfort. If you're fortunate and have a neutral pelvis position and a neutral spine position in your regular life, then maintaining a neutral spine position in exercise is going to be a lot easier. If you're one of those people that tends to be in anterior pelvic tilt, and therefore also probably excessive lordotic extension, then it's going to be a little bit harder. It could be hip flexor muscles that have shortened or just have extra tone, they're tighter, and they pull you into that anterior pelvic tilt and they aggravate that lumbar extension position. So what we might do is work on releasing those or relaxing them so that we can get into a neutral position. All right, so we've hopefully made a pretty good case for why we're going to try to maintain a neutral spine alignment in most of our exercises. That being said, we don't want to never move our spine, but we want to recognize what types of things are going to be beneficial and what kind of things might lead to detrimental effects to our spine. We don't have to live in constant neutral spine position. There are definitely benefits to our disc health from moving our spine around. The spine is meant to move. It's meant to rotate, it's meant to flex, it's meant to extend, it's meant to laterally flex, it's meant to sometimes do those things together, and that's totally fine. Movement in the spine actually helps to maintain disc health. It helps them become more resilient, and it helps to hydrate them. So doing some amount of movement in the spine is good for our discs. Same thing with loading our spine. So holding on to something heavy, either loading with a barbell or front rack position or even holding on to something. When we load the spine, is good for the discs. It builds resilience, it helps them stay hydrated. What we like to avoid is doing that heavy loading when we're not neutral. And then that heavy loading when we're moving into especially end range positions of any of the spine movements. So if we're in extreme flexion or extreme extension, that's probably not the time to be doing that with a very heavy external load. The other thing that is not as well tolerated by a disc is combining movements, especially into the end range. So think of flexion and then rotation, for example. Moving that into the end range of either flexion or rotation or both at the same time, probably not as well tolerated by the discs. Doesn't mean we can't do flexion and rotation at the same time, but if we're thinking about long-term back health, we might not do that with a heavy load or heavy resistance, and we might not do that into the extreme end range of either flexion or rotation. We could definitely be working on rotation without flexion. So think of like a cable or a band rotation exercise. We don't need to flex to do that. We also don't need to rotate in order to flex. So if you're doing a flexion movement, you might deliberately try not to rotate. So we stay neutral in one plane while we're moving in another plane. We could talk about that for hours. Let me know if you want to talk about it.